Okay, so let's take a look at how to handle this dynamic segment. As I mentioned before, what we want to do is what we need to do here is to somehow find out. I don't think this is updating. Okay, start over. Okay, so let's take a look at how to handle this dynamic segment. As mentioned just now, ideally we want to pre-compile the regular expressions that we need to use before the component is even rendered. Because just from the performance perspective, it's also better to pre-compile because you don't want to recompile the regular expression on every single render of your app, right? So let's take a look at the render function here. We have the component to render and we have the props. The question is, how do we figure out which component to use? The difference from the previous exercise is that our route table, we can no longer simply use a object key access check to determine if a component is matched or not. In fact, we will never know unless we iterate through every possible key in the object until we find one that matches, right? So you can brute force this. You can do something like object.keys route table for each key. And then you can compile the regular expression here and then try to see if it matches. It'll work, but it's from a performance perspective, it's not that efficient. So let's create something called a compiled route table. And we are going to iterate through this raw route table, which is essentially provided by our user. And for each path in the route table, we will compile it, right? So now we can use path to regular expression path. And remember, we need the keys array to hold the dynamic segments. In fact, I would just call them dynamic segments here so that it's clear what we're doing. And dynamic segments. Okay, so we got the regular expression, we got the dynamic segments, and we also have a component equals route table path, right? This is the component we want to render. So these three things are needed if we want to check if a raw incoming path matches a certain, to determine whether this component should be rendered given an incoming path. So what we can do is on the compiled route table, we'll just store it. In fact, this compiled route table doesn't even need to be an object. It can be just an array, right? So compiled routes even. It doesn't need to be an object. Compiled routes, push, component, regex, and dynamic segments. So now we've created an array containing our route entries. And what we need to do inside our component here is, instead of iterating through the thing, compiled routes dot. We can do for each, but we can also do sum. This way we can terminate the iteration when we find a route that actually matches. So now we need to check if this is the path that we're getting, that we're currently at. And this is where we need to figure out if this route somehow, this route and this path, somehow they match, right? And the way to find out is to do this. Right? So if there is a match, then the component to render is obviously the component of this route. Right? And notice here, we have component to render here as well. So if none of these routes actually match, then the component to render should probably be not found. Right? So we can initialize it here, or we can initialize it to undefined and just fall back to not found here. Both are okay. And another question is, how do we extract the props to use here? Right? So in fact, the answer is already here. In the comment, we have this piece of code. Actually, this is using the old API, so this is already sort of out of date of this library. But what you need to do, let's copy that piece of code and paste it here. And in fact, you can just do this. You don't even need to reduce. You can just do dynamic segment stuff for each key index props key. Route dot dynamic segment stuff for each. So it actually looks a bit different. So route.dynamic segments is going to be an array that contains objects. Okay, so segment. What we want is segment.name, right? So set it on the props. Okay, and we also need the index here so that we can retrieve the corresponding value from, well, dynamic segments, yeah, from the match result here. So the match will contain the index plus 1. Remember to offset it by 1 because the first element in the match array will be the full matched path. Only the starting from index 1, it's the dynamic segments value. So now we've essentially completed the task. We've figured out which component we should render, and we've filled in the props object with the proper with the extracted dynamic segments if there are any. And we pass it along, and this should work. Yes.
Why do you have a leading slash when you construct the path variable inside render? Why do you prepend that?
Aha. That's because I think in the reference implementation we actually have our route table look like this, right? Because in real route configurations, most of the path you do start with a slash. And and because in some cases you might have nested configurations like this, and you can even have children routes like this. But that's sort of another topic. In fact, if you look at the view router configuration, it looks like this. ID, component, foo, and then it can have children where you can nest them. So in children, you don't start the child path with the slash, so that this can be appended to this. Because if you do this, this will be treated as like an absolute path. That's just, so this will be appended for you implicitly. So I think that this will be slightly different from the reference implementation, but let's hope it works. So it works. Let's make it big. This foo and foo is not being properly separated, so let's make it more obvious. Add a new line here, and foo 1, 2, 3, foo 2, 3, 4. Okay, so notice that if we reload the page at foo 1, 2, 3, it instantly displays this instead of not found. And we can switch between them, and we can also go to bar. So now we've successfully created a semi-working routing system that can handle dynamic segments, and we are able to extract these dynamic segments and pass along them to route components as props. So the next step is, handle nested routes, and that'll be tricky, but I don't think we have time to go over that today. Some other concerns are, for example, how to extract this matching logic instead of having to write it in every app. You can extract this, the whole matching logic out into a component called router view, which is the component that we use in view router. So you can essentially, in your app, you're just dropping this router view, it'll figure out which component it should render at that place. And then we get something really close to what view router actually looks like. Okay, so this closes our routing section. And since it's pretty late, for the next two sections, we're not going really to do the code exercises. I'm just going to sort of talk through them. So the next topic is form validation. So before we go into the actual code, I want to talk about that form validation has two sort of, in terms of components, there are two schools of thought, different styles, I would say. So one of them is markup-based, and the other is model-based. So vValidate and Validate are two of the probably most popular form validation plugins in the Vue ecosystem, and they take two different approaches. Markup-based means the rules for validating a form field is directly declared in the template along with the element itself. Similar to how HTML form elements allows you to do things like input, min length equals 5 or max length equals 20. Everything is sort of on the component directly there. You're essentially declaring your rules right in your template. So that's one way to go about it. The other way to go about it is model-based. Essentially, you declare your validation rules inside JavaScript. The good thing about the model-based validation rule is that your templates will look cleaner. And the other thing is because you're using JavaScript declared rules, it's easier to implement custom validation rules. If you go the market-based route, you're essentially relying on the library or the plugin to pre-implement all the validation rules for you so that you can directly reference them in your template using attributes or directives. But using a JavaScript-based validation rule, in addition to these built-in rules that the library provides, you can implement your own. You can mix and match using existing validation libraries, pure JavaScript validation libraries, to combine it with your validation plugin to do things. So in the next example, I'm going to walk through how to build a very simple version of a validation library that's very similar to how Validate works in practice. And we'll actually find this pretty familiar. So let's look at the usage first. Okay, just ignore this super long regular expression. It's just for checking whether a string is an email. And we have an app. We have some data. Oh, this is so small. I'm sorry. We have an app. We have some data. We have a text, which is foo, and email, which starts with an empty string. And notice this custom option, validations. So this looks very, very similar to the plugin that we wrote in the morning, right? It's a validations custom option, contains text and email, and each of them contains a validate function and a message function. Notice this message is not just a static string. It is actually a function. that takes the key and value of the current value so that you can generate dynamic warning messages at runtime. So text length must be bigger than 5. And for email, we just tested against the email regular expression to check whether it's valid. And the good thing about being in JavaScript is, right, this function, you can replace it with anything you like. So if the library provides some built-in, you can say like, you can have helper functions that just help you create these validator functions for you, right? And you can have, you can also have, for example, compose greater than 5, all capitalized, all caps. So you can sort of have all these, like in JavaScript land, you can play with your creativity and compose all these validation rules and make them work together. Or you can make your plugin more powerful by accepting an array of validator functions. That's all up to you. But for now, we're just going to do value. It must have a minimum length of 5. Okay, so and then we have this validate function doesn't really. We'll use it when we submit the form. So when the user attempts to submit the form, we'll again do a check to prevent it from submitting if the form is not valid. And notice that we're using this thing. This is sort of like, what is this $V thing, right? So this $V is going to be sort of injected or provided by the plugin. And this $V will be sort of a big object that contains the whole state of your current validation state. So this top level valid property essentially means the whole form is valid or not. If any of the fields fail the validation, this valid value will be false. And then there's some other things that if you look at the template here, we have a form, and on the form submit, we will call the validate function. So that will help us preventing the page from reloading. And input with vModel, pretty straightforward. Just syncs the input into our online data. And notice this part. This is the part where we display validation errors. So notice that vif equals not valid if this block only shows up if the form is not currently valid. And it has a red color. So the good thing here is notice that we are responsible for rendering form errors ourselves because from the plugin's perspective, all it does is provide some state. How to present that state, how to present it to the user, how to style all of the messages, where to place them, completely up to you, right? So this gives you more room for customization and flexibility. So we can just iterate through $v.errors. So this is another API requirement. The $v should expose an array of errors, which can just be strings. So we'll just like show them here. And then we have a form submit button, which you can disable the button based on the valid status of the form. So let's take a look at. So if we check out the solutions. Oops. And run the code. This is how it looks like, right? So our default state already triggers warnings. So text should have a main length of 5 but got 3. And the email is empty, so it's not valid. And the whole form is disabled because it's not valid. So let's fill in something. Once we have a string longer than 5, the first warning disappears, and let's just, and it's valid. So this email address gets a lot of emails. It's actually a valid email address. Because it's used so often, it's almost like DDoSed all the time. So how do we implement that? Let's go back to the master branch and try to implement that. So remember, for any plugin, we should have an install method which takes view as the argument. And let's think about what we need to do for this plugin. We need to be able to process this custom validations object. So that means we need to have a global mixing that injects a created hook into every component. And then we check if this options dot validations. This is where we need to do work, right? So some of the, let's see if we actually should use the created hook, right? There's really, so some of you might start to think you can set up watchers in the created hook for each of the properties, run through the validations, and then set the data onto the $v, right? That works. That could indeed work, but that feels very imperative, right? Is there a more declarative way to think about this? And the fact is, there is. So let's look at this $v thing. What should it be? Should it be just an object on the instance that we can mutate? Or could it just be some declarative mapping from our current form state? So if we take that approach, let's actually mix it in as a computed property, right? So you can do this. And now, inside this computed property, you still have access to this .options.validations, right? But so a more optimized version of this plugin would only mixing this $v property if this .options.validation is found. So you can do something like created if this options validations this options. So at this point, unfortunately, the computed properties would have already been initialized. But if you use before create, inside before create, computed properties, the reactivity system has not been set up yet. So here's your chance to kind of cheat the system and like sort of just do this. So you essentially create a overwrite this see what we're doing here? We're not, so we need to retain whatever is already declared there, but this might be undefined. So we're just using object assign here because it can handle undefined values. Essentially, we want to clone everything, if there is any, into this empty object, and then eventually we add this $v functionality to it. So this inside this $v, we want to do return something, right? And it should probably have errors, if there are any, and a valid status, right? So the question becomes, let valid equals true, const errors equals an array. Now the question becomes, how do we do this? How do we map the current current status to these valid or errors? This becomes much more straightforward. See, like this is just synchronous computation. You're going from some state to another. And where do we get the form state that we care about? Notice that we have this. So let's extract it out. Const rules. Again, we're going to iterate through the rules. Object keys, rules for each key. And in here, we'll have rule equals rules key, const current value equals. Now we are trying to get the value. So where do we get this? Just take it from this, right? Because we are inside a computed property, we have access to this, which is component instance. And this key actually points to the field that this particular rule is interested in. Now this is very similar to what we did in the plugin that we did in the morning. We can just do const result equals rule dot validate. So we just do this. Validate value, right? If the result fails, something should happen, and that is setting the whole form to invalid. Invalidate the whole form if any one of them fails, right? And we need to push a message into the errors. And where do we get that? We can do push rule.message. Remember, message is also a function. It takes the key, takes the value. And that's pretty much it. So we're iterating through the rules. For each rule, we'll retrieve the current value and run the validate function. If the result does not validate, we will set the whole form to invalid status and push the corresponding message into our errors array. And after we do this, we simply return this object that contains the valid field and errors. Now this is just a computed property. So notice that this is where reactivity is registered. When we access this key, this is similar to a dot access, which triggers the getter on our instance. So it registers the reactivity, which means when any of these fields change, our computed property will be properly updated. So let's take a look. It doesn't work. Let's see. It's not defined by reference to a render. Okay, so this $v is not being defined. Okay, so options computed. Well, so just to be safe, our monkey patch and options scheme may not be working properly. So what we want to do is take this whole part out, and instead we will simply mix this computed property into every instance. Well, this matching is, my screen is too big, so the sensitivity of the scrolling is much too high. All right, so I believe we can take these out. Okay, still doesn't work. Rules is now defined. Oh, okay. Const rules equal this dot options dot validations. If rules. Well, actually you don't. So object keys works on, let's just do this. Okay. So we're achieving the desired result here. And all with just a single computed property. Really, like, all it does is, it's actually pretty functional if you think about it. So we have, this is the input. The validation is the input, and this key is also input. So The data source is the current state of your component and these validation rules. All we do is compute the current status based on these source data, and then return it from within a computed property. And with this computed property, we can do arbitrary rendering styling, decide how to actually present these error messages to the user. And you can decide, preventing form submissions, disabling buttons. Everything is state-driven. This is sort of the way you do model-based validation, and it actually is very similar to how Validate works. So if you like this style of form validation, you should probably check out Validate. And yeah, the final topic that we're going to talk about is internationalization. So again, internationalization can take different styles. There is a plugin called View I80N by Kazupong, who is a core team member from Japan, and he's been experimenting extensively about internationalization, and he experimented with 3 different approaches. The first is what we're going to discuss here, is the most straightforward and obvious solution, but it comes with some performance cost if your app is really huge. And that is, if you want something to be internationalized, you will use this special $T function and give it a slug name or ID, which will then go into your locale dictionary and find the correct message and just render it. Very straightforward. The other 2 approaches, the other one is another one is going with directives. So so you do something like VI80N equals welcome message, and then it just goes like this. So the advantage of using directives is if you don't care about server-side rendering, inside directives you can directly manipulate this current element. So essentially the update will be very fast because it doesn't have to go through Vue's virtual DOM diffing process. So you will achieve slightly better performance, especially when you're dynamically switching between languages. But it's really just an API difference, and the limitation of the directive-based internationalization is you won't be able to use it everywhere. In some cases, you still need to use $T in cases where directive just simply won't work. For example, in JavaScript. And the final approach, which is sort of out of scope of this, but let's look at this piece of information. As I talked about earlier, templates are static, so they're very easy to analyze. So it's possible to say inside ViewLoader, we can add a ViewLoader compilation plugin. So there is this hidden feature in ViewLoader that allows you to inject custom template compilation modules to allow you to do transforms of Vue templates at compile time. So Kazupan actually wrote a plugin that analyzes the templates at compile time and find references to $T inside the template and compile them, basically replace them with the correct localized text at compile time. Then he builds like 3 different versions of his app and deploy them. So instead of dynamically switching between it at runtime, he has 3 static versions of his app, all pre-compiled. Now this completely eliminates the runtime cost of looking up the locales, and you have to ship the locale JSON dictionary to the client, and all the extra overhead are gone because they're all kind of moved to the compilation phase. So this is a valid strategy if performance is extremely important and you're okay with the deployment overhead where you have to maintain 3 branches under 3 different URLs. But if performance gain is huge, then it's probably worth it. But here we're just going to simply talk about how to write a simple plugin that exposes this $T method, right? So, and the usage looks like this. we're finally using this second argument of our view use function. So you can pass in additional options into when you use a plugin. And in the case of the I80M plugin, we're just going to pass in the locale dictionary, which contains a few different languages. This is Netherlands because I I gave the workshop in Netherlands before. So in terms of language, we will be requiring the user to declare a reactive data property called lan at the root level. And the way you change language is simply just setting it to a different language. So let's implement this quickly. Our install function takes view itself and the locales, right? And we need to mixing. So we need this $t function to be available everywhere in every component. So we can do the mixing thing. We can do like methods $t, but this is less efficient than, say, just do view.prototype.$t equals something else. Right? We just attach it to view's prototype, and this will become available in every view instance. This is just how prototypal inheritance in JavaScript works. And this will be much more performant because there won't be any runtime overhead of finding the methods option and then setting up the method and all that stuff. And what we do is this function will take some ID. And in fact, we don't want it to be an arrow function because we do need access to this ID. And now we need another thing to figure out what to do, because first we need access to the ID, then we need the locales, and then we need the current language. Where do we find the current language? All right. So if you're using a state management pattern, you can store the current language in the store, and that would be very straightforward. You just somehow feed the store via the option into your plugin, and the plugin will have access to your store. But in this case, we're just gonna do it quick and dirty way. We require that the user have this lan property in the root instance, so we know it should always be there. So we just do this.root.lan. This is our language, right? So, and we can find the dictionary from the locales and find the corresponding ID and just return it. And this is pretty much it. So yeah, switching between them works. And so there really isn't too much to it. The only thing I want to sort of emphasize is, so this is kind of a combination of the plugin exercise and the reactivity section, because understanding why the language switching works is pretty important here. This $t function references this $root lam. This dot here is what registers the reactivity. And it's important this lan is a data property instead of static property because it needs to be reactive, right? This is also what enables it to trigger changes when we later on set the lan to a different value. And why would this register reactivity? Because this $t function was invoked here in the template. And when the template gets compiled into render functions, this $t will also be invoked when the render function renders. That's why the whole render function also registers root lan as a dependency, and that's why later on the whole switching works. So yeah, this is essentially it. If you're using directives, things might have to work a little bit differently, but we don't really have that much time to talk about that now. So that's pretty much it for the whole workshop. So if you have any questions, I can answer them now before we close shop.
Any questions online? Any questions in the room?
Yes.
I have a question. I promised my manager I would ask this when she allowed me to come to this workshop today. We are looking at transitioning a product in the front-end space away from an older framework. We're looking at React and we're looking at Vue. What are the major points that we should be aware of? Obviously, we've read the React versus Vue comparisons on the website, but talking about things like testing or about translation, which we just covered briefly, what are the big points I can go back to her and say, this is why we should use Vue?
Because this question really depends on, so there was a recent article on Medium talking about someone who was choosing frameworks and he chose Vue. And one thing to realize about like making these framework decisions is that your company's situation really kind of dictates the result. Like, it's hard to make a blanket statement to say Vue is better than React unless we have concrete situation. For example, the Medium article talked about how he was having a legacy app with a lot of bugs, and the cost of migrating it was just upgrading the old app was just too high, and they have limited resources. There was only like one developer at that time, and they need to be able to very quickly onboard new devs onto this new app, and they need to rewrite it. And so development efficiency and time pressure all plays into this of how fast can you build something and how fast can you onboard new devs to it. And personally, I feel that in terms of onboarding speed, Vue is probably the best among the current mainstream frameworks. So let's say if you read through the docs and you are already pretty good at JavaScript, you should be able to pick up Vue reasonably fast. Like in a day or two, you should be able to do some basic things. And in a week, you should feel very comfortable contributing to something in production, right? Which is not necessarily the case when we speak about some bigger frameworks, which are more complex. There are more concepts you need to you have to grab more concepts to be able to feel confident. I think that's one big thing. So if onboarding speed is really important for the current your timeline, then I think Vue would be a really good choice. That's one of the biggest advantage I would say, because eventually, if you have enough time, in the long run, all the three major frameworks are able to sort of provide the necessary bits that you will eventually need. But another aspect of it is productivity, or when we talk about productivity, it's kind of important to realize that it's not always objective. Productivity has a lot to do with the subjective preference of your team. If your team, so I've observed that the developers camp kind of very naturally falls into different camps when there are preferences involved. And a lot of times you cannot really easily force people to overcome their preference in a lot of ways. Like the JSX versus template debate, I've just seen it so many times. So many people have voiced their opinions, but still, like, this conversation just goes on and on. And sometimes it's just really hard to change people's mind. And even if you believe something is objectively superior, if the other developer just hates it, he will never be really productive with it, right? If he doesn't fall in love with it, he probably won't enjoy working on the app. So his productivity will naturally fall. So I think it's important to actually let the team try things and get their direct feedback on whether they enjoy working with the framework. If they do, then it's a good indicator that they will be more productive than with, say, another framework. And I wouldn't say like Vue is always the more pleasant one, because some people do prefer React or prefer Angular. So it's important to find it out for your team, because every team will consist of different developers. Yeah. So try it out is, I think, the most important thing. So To answer your question, I wouldn't necessarily believe your company would be better off using Vue. It really depends on the result of actually trying it. Yeah.
What do you think about web components? Is it possible that in the future Vue will use web components, Shadow DOM, stuff like that?
So there's a possibility because we do have, say for example, Angular 2 or 4 does have like different modes where one of it is using actual web components, the other is kind of implicitly falling back. It's feasible that in the future when web components are indeed supported in all browsers or cover more than 98% of your user base, we will eventually ship a version that leverages some of the features. It will not necessarily be full-on web components. We will probably be able to leverage Shadow DOM for style encapsulation. We will probably be able to leverage some of the features that comes along with it. But I still believe that web components ultimately would probably serve better as a form of distribution for interop between frameworks. So some of the libraries are pretty good at, for example, Svelte is pretty good at compiling itself down into formats that doesn't need a big runtime. So those are really good for distributing. Wrap it up as a web component. You can throw in any framework and you can use it. I think that's the biggest value of web components at this moment. The biggest hurdle is still browser support. And also, we see that React has brought up a lot of ideas, for example, declarative and functional programming that are not necessarily problems that are even addressed by web components. So web components isn't going to be this sort of once and for all, and the framework will. I don't think that's going to happen. It's more or less going to be this. I think its biggest value is sort of bringing about these upcoming new primitives that frameworks can then leverage to simplify their own implementations or build on top of it, and then facilitate interop between different frameworks. Yeah, that's my view of it. So,
can you elaborate when we should choose Vuex with Vue versus Redux with Vue?
Well, my opinion is, unless you are super into immutable and functional stuff, you should always use Vuex because it's designed to work with Vue and better DevTools integration, and also it just the way that Vuex relies on mutations fits more naturally with how Vue detects changes in its rendering architecture. So it's naturally more optimized out of the box, I would say. With Redux, it's still pretty efficient, but just not as efficient as Vuex would be. And also another thing is Vuex, if from a say hiring perspective, since Vuex is the official state management pattern for Vue, so if you're hiring a new Vue dev, he or she would probably be already somewhat familiar with Vuex, but not necessarily with Redux.
Wait for the plane to go overhead and then we'll pretty close. All right. Yeah. When should we consider using server-side rendering with like Nux? Is it purely performance or SEO, or where exactly would the line be?
So if you go to ssr.vuejs.org, there is the first page literally talks about why server-side rendering, and I think it would be better off to just read that page than me to just read over it here. But to sum up, yes, better SEO, better time to content. There are trade-offs, obviously. You will have a more complex build setup and deployment requirements. And your code will also have some restrictions. You cannot just access the DOM anywhere you want. But the benefit is that your app will be able to render the first content faster. And this really only matters when your business model depends on time to content, right? So let's say you're building a back-end dashboard that's used internally. Nobody cares how fast it loads as long as it loads within like a second or two, right? Unless it's like taking 5 seconds, that's probably too long. But most Vue apps would definitely render within a second. So in those cases, server-side rendering is completely unnecessary. So it's really identifying the product you're trying to build and whether time to content and SEO are that important, and then weigh it against the trade-offs of the extra deployment requirements. The benefits of pure client-side app is that deployment is extremely simple. Everything is just static assets. You can throw it up on a CDN and have very good performance. But if you have server-side rendering, you have a pretty significant server-side cost because now you have to run Node.js servers to render stuff on every request. So you kind of have to weigh the pros and cons. Yeah.
Maybe you want to read that question about Vue custom element.
Yeah, so last question is how safe it will be to use Vue custom element as long as it's not maintained anymore by Vue official. So I haven't really been following along with the latest development of that library that much. Our original implementation was really just a proof of concept, but the author of the new Vue custom element library actually does a very good job. He's very dedicated in filling out the gap in that way. But honestly, I haven't been paying close enough attention to that library lately. So I'm afraid I cannot really say you should or should not use it. But I think just saying the same way as you evaluate any library, just look at its maintenance record, how fast does the author respond to issues or push new commits. You would be able to get a general sense of how stable or reliable the library is. Yes.
What are you excited about that's upcoming?
Upcoming, one of the things we are going to do is, so we're going to, the next big thing in Vue is probably a rewrite, a build that only runs in latest modern browsers. Currently, we have a lot of code that's dealing with legacy browsers like IE9 or stuff, which sort of bloats the library itself and places a lot of restrictions because we cannot use any of the latest ES features. And it's kind of a pain because like when you know like ES's set or map would be better suited for this case, but you cannot use it, so you have to like shim it yourself or use a less capable alternative in the library. I'm pretty looking forward to the day where like IE is just completely dead, so that I can drop everything about them, and then we can and we'll rewrite the reactivity system using ES 2015 proxies, which will be able to get rid of some of the gotchas we currently have in Vue. For example, adding new properties. You no longer have to call view.set if you were using proxies. And you can also directly assign to indices into arrays without having to use viewSet again. And you can delete properties or and observation will be lazy by default. So there will be a lot of benefits if we are able to sort of both drop a lot of weight and also improve the current system even more.
And will that be like a side-by-side of
Yes.
modern and okay?
Yes.
What's the last year and a half been like for you?
Last year and a half, it's been pretty amazing. So it's a big transition, like going from working for companies to going to work for yourself, and it's like, but it's good because this is something I am really passionate about. So when I'm working on Vue, I'm solving all these problems. It doesn't really feel like I'm being forced to work on it. It's like I want to work on it. So I feel that this alone is very liberating and probably worth a lot of utility to me. Like I'm willing to just earn less money, but like in fact, I've been earning more or less the same or even more than before I before I started to work on this full time. So I'm pretty happy about where I am right now. Like this is kind of my Twitter description says I'm living a dream. Like just working full time on open source. It's pretty amazing. Yeah.
So with that, you should pitch your Patreon.
Oh yeah, yes. If you're watching this, yeah, please. The Patreon, patreon.com/evan. Like, so we actually accept both individuals and companies. So if your company uses Vue and is really liking it, please consider becoming a sponsor. And if you sponsor, your logo gets listed here. We also have a dedicated sponsor page that shows all the current sponsors. This is really the main source of income to keep Vue development going. So yeah, I'll take this chance to pitch it.
Yeah.
Please.
Awesome. With that,
All
any other final questions? Otherwise, we'll wrap this up. All right. Well, that's
Cool.
it.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks for the warriors online that joined us all the way through the end.